Silent Hill 2 is full of terrifying monsters. From the mannequins to Pyramid Head, every adversary James encounters in the town is designed to test him physically and emotionally, to reflect his deepest thoughts and darkest sins, and to push him towards the terrible truth he's buried deep within his subconscious. But with all due respect to the Red Pyramid thing, the manifestation that provides James with his greatest challenge is Maria. Arguably the game's true antagonist, Maria is both a dark reflection of James's late wife Mary, and a chauvinist fantasy version of her. Through her attempts to distract our protagonist and replace Mary, the player gets a first-hand look at James's selfish side, while the town itself uses her as a means to remind him of the crime he committed just 3 days ago. And should the player pursue her ending, they'll witness the most vile portrayal of James imaginable, a version of James that embraces everything Maria represents. James encounters Maria for the first time in Rosewater Park. It's a fitting place for them to meet. Rosewater Park is one of several places in Silent Hill that him and Mary consider to be special. From a distance, obscured by the fog, James thinks that Maria is indeed Mary, but once she turns around, he realizes it's not her. Maria teases him, asking James if she looks like his girlfriend, which prompts him to say that she does look like his late wife. Her face, her voice, it's all so close, but there's something off about her, something not quite right. Prodding him further, she says that she isn't a ghost, and touches him to prove that she's warm. Aware that something is wrong here, James tries to leave, saying that he needs to find Mary. It's then that Maria reminds him that Mary is dead, calling into question James's central purpose in coming to Silent Hill. This theme continues for the next several lines, as James tells Maria about the letter he received from Mary, and says that despite how it sounds, he isn't crazy. But that is exactly how Maria is trying to make James feel. She's trying to make him question his core motivation, his drive to find Mary, something she does throughout the game. Time and time again, Maria tries to distract our protagonist from the truth, from accepting the reality of what he did to his wife, and instead submit to the selfish desires he struggled with while she was sick. The selfish desires that, depending on your interpretation of his character, are either a background issue, a contributing factor to, or the sole motivator for his crime. These selfish desires are reflected in Maria's character design. She is, to put it mildly, an overly sexualized version of Mary. Even when she was healthy, as shown in James's picture of her, Mary dressed modestly and kept her hair up. Maria has her hair down, the tips dyed pink, and wears tight and revealing clothing. Maria looks like she's about to go to a Metallica concert. Mary looks like she's about to go to church. The same is true of her mannerisms. She's mysterious, flirty, and saunters about the pier in a deliberately provocative manner. She is, in so many ways, his wife, but redesigned through some frat boy's wet dream. As a manifestation of the town, and therefore inspired by a piece of James's subconscious, it speaks volumes about the sexual frustration he must have felt during Mary's illness, a point that is also illustrated through the designs of various monsters, the actions of Pyramid Head himself, and Maria's behavior later on at Heaven's Night. Honestly, the fact that Heaven's Night exists in the first place speaks to this as well. And you shouldn't need me to tell you that none of this makes James look good. His wife was dying of an incurable disease. His desire to get laid should have been the least of his concerns. But so many aspects of the town, Maria chief among them, indicate just how significant an issue this was for him. To be fair to James, having sexual needs is only human. But the way the game consistently draws attention to James's sexual frustration through monsters and Maria isn't meant to touch on this element of human nature, but rather to highlight his selfishness for thinking about his lack of sex while the woman he was supposed to support through sickness and in health was dying. To highlight, and of course, to punish. But back to the conversation. Maria presses James for information about the letter, and though he's hesitant and still off-put by her, he does reveal that it said she was waiting for him in their, quote, special place. Compared to the other two characters who were suffering in Silent Hill, Angela and Eddie, James sometimes comes off as more in control than his counterparts, at least here in the early hours of the game. Don't get me wrong, this changes completely by the end of the second act, when James' sins, internal conflict, and damaged psyche are laid bare. But in the opening act, I'd argue that he does seem to be more put together. Shortly before this scene, in Woodside and Blue Creek apartments, Angela was struggling with her depression and past trauma, while Eddie was throwing up and terrified of the monsters. James, on the other hand, is primarily dealing with the external conflict of the monsters in the town and the mystery of Mary's letter at this point in the narrative, hence why I'd say that he, initially, seems to be more in control than his counterparts. But that's not the case here with Maria. Between the way she brings up that Mary is dead, and how ridiculous he sounds when he says that his departed wife is waiting for him in their quote, special place, it makes him sound truly delusional. These two details combined demonstrate a key part of the dynamic between James and Maria. She's always running circles around him, and often to a surprising and unsettling extent. Whenever they're together, she's generally in control of the interactions, leaving our protagonist to look like a lost and confused puppy. Looking as dejected as ever, James admits that he's not sure where their special place is. He knows that this whole town was their special place, but many of the specifics are still lost to him. Maria says that she hasn't seen Mary, and then offers to take him someplace she thinks two lovers might call special. Again, illustrating her control and sexuality, she makes some advances on him, touching his chest in a sensual manner. James recoils from her, and Maria says that she was just messing with him before walking down the pier to guide him to her so-called special place. James is surprised that she wants to go with him, and questions why she can't just tell him where it is, at which point she asks him how he could leave her alone with all the monsters around. This is our first indication that Maria can indeed see James as tormentors, which might initially make one think that she's as real as Angela or Eddie, or even someone drawn to the town like the two of them. But the simple truth is that as a manifestation of the town, she too can see the monsters Silent Hill creates to attack James. In principle, by asking James to protect her from the monsters, Maria touches on another facet of the way she serves as a fantasy for our protagonist. She's not just an over-sexualized version of his wife, she's a version of his wife that wants him to protect her. If the former is intended to play into the desires of the adult man, then the latter is intended to play into formative daydreams. In our youth, we grow up dreaming of being superheroes and knights in shining armor. There's nothing wrong with this, of course, but as we grow older, we have to temper those expectations. There are no dragons to slay or princesses that need saving in the real world. But by asking James to keep her safe, Maria is allowing James to indulge in a part of his subconscious that still thinks he can be the dragon slayer and the princess saver. I'd love to do a complete analysis of Silent Hill 2 through this type of lens, but for now, I'll say that it's truly stunning to me how much Maria triggers traditional masculine stereotypes. Between her sexuality and her need to be protected, she's targeting all the parts of his subconscious that thinks those fantasies can still become reality. From there, Maria questions James about his hesitancy to protect her, asking him if it's because she reminds him of Mary. As I mentioned earlier, part of Maria's purpose is to distract James from the true goal of finding Mary and coming to terms with what he did to her. This is more of that, along with what the distraction can evolve into, replacement, as we'll see in the Maria ending. She's firing the opening salvos of that mindset here, trying to get him to move past Mary and focus on her instead. James gets frustrated with Maria, then tells her to come on, and together the duo heads off into the fog of Silent Hill. Before we move on, let's talk about that frustration for a moment. As I've said across all of my Silent Hill 2 videos now, the remake's James Sunderland, portrayed by Luke Roberts, is slightly different than the original's James Sunderland, portrayed by Guy Seehey. But in a game as complex as Silent Hill 2, and for a character as nuanced as James, even a slight difference can make a world of impact, especially when it comes to your final interpretation of his character and the ending you prefer. Typically, when I brought this up, it's in reference to how remake James is generally portrayed to be softer and somewhat kinder than original James, as we see with Laura and Angela. Here, I definitely wouldn't say that remake James is softer around Maria, but I would say that he's more hesitant around her than original James. Original James seemed perplexed by her presence, but far more willing to indulge her. Meanwhile, in this scene, James is resistant to her touch, gets noticeably frustrated with her, and looks at her with a mix of confusion, revulsion, and concern. His approach towards her evolves as the game goes on, but given that these elements do resurface, it's enough to influence my ultimate interpretation of him. But again, as I've said every time this topic has come up, we'll get into all of that when I cover James in his own video in August. One more thing that I think it's important to qualify before I continue is what I mean when I talk about Maria's motivations. Though there's a compelling argument to be made that she is the game's true antagonist, she is the final boss in a majority of the endings, and though she does tempt James towards his selfish side, I wouldn't describe her as a master manipulator or a succubus or anything along those lines. Rather, as a manifestation of the town with a purpose to serve in James's Silent Hill journey, she's simply fulfilling her role and doing what's in her nature. The same way Pyramid Head has a role to play, so does she. At first, that role is to try and encourage our protagonist to dive headfirst into the negative aspects of his personality, but Silent Hill will utilize her in a different way later on. What follows is a transparent exploration of the formative fantasy I mentioned earlier, the idea of James as a protector for Maria, her valiant white knight. They explore the town and can find some excellent callbacks to the original Silent Hill 2. You can even find 2000s Maria's old school Avril Lavigne inspired outfit and multiple Polaroids. But monsters lurk behind every corner, and she's helpless and unarmed, meaning that it's up to James to protect her. The importance of this task reaches its apex in one of Silent Hill's residential areas, where the duo finds one of the town's many dead ends, and in the process of finding another way forward are surrounded by monsters. Your success, or lack thereof, in protecting Maria during this stretch of the game will help determine what ending you get. Stick closer to her and keep her safe, and you'll have a better chance at triggering the Maria ending, which we'll be discussing in detail later on, because it, obviously, concerns her more directly than all the others. From a strategic point of view, it's smart to do this. The other two standard endings to Silent Hill 2, Leave and In Water, are easier to manipulate, even if you are on the path to the Maria ending. So it makes sense to shoot for the Maria ending, and hold off on triggering the other two until you've got a save bank somewhere in the third act. But from a critical perspective, I think that the game's focus on protecting Maria isn't just a reflection of James's White Knight syndrome, but also how helpless he surely felt during Mary's illness. Part of what makes the terminal illness of a loved one such a perfect lens through which to explore masculine tropes is the fact that there's very little that can be done about it. You can't punch cancer or shoot it with a gun. You have to put your faith in doctors and modern medicine. And even then, the reality of Mary's situation is that she was past the point of no return. But he can help Maria. He can kill the monsters threatening her, shoot them with his rifle, or bash them to death with his pipe. What he couldn't do to Mary's cancer, he can do to protect Maria from the horrors of Silent Hill. But like most things with Maria, this doubles back into the subject of James's selfishness. He might not have been able to save Mary from her cancer, but there were things he could do to support her, to make her final days on this earth as bright as they possibly could be. The fact that James's subconscious manifests the regret of being unable to protect her rather than the regret of his failure to better support her is further representative of the selfishness that, no matter how you view James in the grand scheme of things, does exist in his character profile. Eventually, James and Maria will reach the so-called special place for lovers that she mentioned back at the pier. They arrive at the back of the building, obscuring its true identity for the time being. James is unable to get inside, but there is a sticker of a butterfly on the door, a recurring symbol from Maria, indicating that she can. And open it she does, with a key that she'd been keeping in her shirt. James enters hesitantly, only to discover that Maria's so-called special place for lovers is actually Heaven's Night, a strip club. In an instant, we cross the line from formative daydreams of knighthood that still have a hold on James's subconscious and suggestions of sexual frustration to straight-up chauvinism. James's wife is back, sexier than ever, and she's taking him to a strip club. I wish I could say that there aren't people in the world who would think that James's current state of affairs was a good thing, but we all know that they're out there. On some level, the game is trying to make us wonder if James is one of those supremely disgusting people. Though Maria will later claim that this wasn't the so-called special place for lovers she was talking about, and that they were just passing through here, this is obviously bullshit. By bringing James here, she's trying to tempt him into diving headfirst into those desires, and keep him from finding Mary. As for the existence of Heaven's Night itself, there are multiple ways you can interpret it. The traditional view on Heaven's Night is that it is intended to demonstrate explicitly that James visited strip clubs during Mary's illness. If so, it's a further indication of his selfishness. His wife was dying of an incurable disease. He should have been spending his time and money on her, not strippers. Again, as I said earlier, it's only human for James to have sexual needs. But if this is how he was expressing them, then that is truly reprehensible. The other interpretation is more symbolic, which is that Heaven's Night is just another indication of James's sexual frustrations during Mary's illness. As in, James didn't actually frequent strip clubs while Mary was sick, but rather that Heaven's Night is a manifestation, a very 90s manifestation, of how much he struggled with the lack of intimacy. This, too, remains an indication of his selfishness, but leaves him looking less reprehensible than the other possibility. Personally, given the game's tendency towards suggestion, the implication in its writing style, and James's overall hesitancy in the scene, I'm partial to this interpretation, but that's just me. I'll leave the final verdict on Heaven's Night up to you. But in any case, once the lights come on, Maria takes the stage and begins to play around with the stripper pole. We don't see how James immediately responds to it, but given that she tells him not to give her that look, it seems like he's put off by it. She then says that she was just kidding, and when asked if this is indeed her special place, she says that they just need to go out and through the front. But again, she's lying, something she gives away with her next lines, where she suggests that they just stay here a while. If Maria's ultimate goal is to keep James distracted and away from Mary, then tying all this together, what's happening here in the opening part of the scene is that Maria first tries to do so with her sexuality, and then, when it doesn't work, she tries to do so by encouraging him just to relax and unwind. From lust to sloth, if you will. Even this, she tries to do with some flirtatiousness, but you get the point. In response, James gets frustrated with her once more, saying forcefully that Mary could be out there waiting for him. He doesn't have time just to sit around and relax in a strip club. You can take this as an early indication of James's propensity to snap, his tendency to be surly, to borrow Mary's words. But I'd argue it's in line with the more dismissive, irritated way he's feeling towards Maria and Heaven's Night in general in this scene. James's words cause Maria to break down and vent her own frustrations about the situation they're in, about the monsters and the dangers of the town, and how she just wanted to get away from it for a second. Our protagonist apologizes and attempts to console her, and then admits that Silent Hill is getting to him too. Which of course is rather ironic. This whole place is designed to get to him. He then asks Maria if he's crazy for thinking Mary could really be here, and though we'll get to how she responds in a moment, take note of how quickly Maria's tone shifts after he says he's sorry and takes a seat at the bar. This seems to indicate, to me anyway, that even her own breakdown was another ploy to distract James. Lust didn't work, sloth didn't work, so now she's going to try and make him pity her. And it does succeed, at least for a moment. In answering James's question, Maria says that crazy is one word for it, but that another would be hopeful. He's oblivious to it, but much as she is most of the time Mary comes up in conversation with Maria, she's taunting him here, running circles around him. She then takes out a bottle of booze, I think it's whiskey, and pours James a glass, encouraging him to drink it to take the edge off. James says nothing, which leads to Maria calling him out for, essentially, refusing to have a little fun, and then does a toast to hope undying. Again, I suspect this is a bit of a taunt that James doesn't pick up on. When the camera cuts back to James, we see why he didn't respond to Maria when she offered him a drink. The entire time, he was struggling to turn it down. You can see it in the pained expression on his face and his twitching fingers. He really, really wanted to take that drink, and it took all of his willpower not to do so. This is a sign that James turned to alcohol during Mary's illness, that he used the bottle to drown his sorrows and numb his emotions. Internal Monologue told us this in the original game, but this shows it to us in a clearer, more cinematic manner. That James developed an alcohol dependency is no surprise. It's something many folks turn to during hardships, and it's especially common for men who are in the situation James was in, with a wife who was dying of a terminal illness. He couldn't white knight away her pain, and for a variety of reasons, he struggled to support her. So instead, he used alcohol to distract himself, which is exactly what Maria is encouraging him to do here. Altogether, this makes James's encounter with Maria at Heaven's Night a truly fascinating scene. She tempts him with several vices, lust, sloth, alcohol, before they ultimately continue on their journey through the fog of Silent Hill. She's consistently trying to distract him and keep him from the truth, and she really does pull out every weapon she has here. After leaving Heaven's Night, James continues to protect Maria as they venture through the town. All the while, she's leading him to another so-called special place. This time, it's a garden called Moonlight Grove. There, in the shadow of a statue, she tells him the following local legend.
There's a story told around these parts. Kind of a local legend. It tells of a woman who was cast out, sentenced to die on an island out on the lake. There was a man in town who fell madly in love with her. And every night, he would sneak out, row across the lake, bringing her food and company. And every night, she would stand there on the shore, holding a lit candle to help him find his way. But this one night, a terrible storm broke out, caught him out in the open, and it blew out the candle. Even in darkness, the man would not give up. He would not turn back. So he fought against the raging waters until finally the lake took him. They say even then, the woman never lost hope. She kept coming out at night, kept lighting the candle to bring her beloved home, to lead him to shore.
It's worth noting that this entire scene and local legend is completely new to the remake. It doesn't appear in the original at all. But I'm a huge fan of it. It really plays into all my English teacher sensibilities, which is the vibe we go for here on this channel. Because this tale is intended to be a clear and obvious parallel to the story of James and Mary. Even the way it's introduced feels like something that would come up in a novel. It's an added aside at a natural resting point in the story, meant to restate what we know so far about their marriage and her illness in an allegorical way. It also touches on the subject of hope undying, which Maria mentioned back at Heaven's Night. On the surface, I think that's what this story is meant to do, to prompt players to think deeper about what we've been told so far about James, Mary, their marriage, and her illness through the lens of metaphor. I've said this in other videos from this series, but the Silent Hill 2 remake is twice as long as the original game, meaning that Bloober Team needed to devote time to repeating and reminding players of certain key points. With an 8 to 10 hour game, you don't need to do this, but with a 20-hour game, you do. In some ways, I consider this the Maria arc equivalent of James's meeting with Angela in Rosewater Park. Both were additions Bloober Team made to the middle of the game, and I'd wager they did so for the very same purpose. But nothing in Silent Hill 2 exists in a vacuum, and thus, I believe there is more we can glean from this story. Consider for a moment its source, Maria, whose purpose is to distract James, to keep him from accepting the truth about what he did to Mary, and instead embrace all the selfish, base parts of his personality that she represents. What Maria is telling James here is that his wife's proverbial light has gone out, and that if he continues to pursue this search for her and doesn't move on with her, specifically, then he's going to end up in water, just like the man from the story. You can take this as another nod to the canonicity of that particular ending if you'd like, but again, consider the source. Ironically, though the story is supposedly about undying love, Maria's goal in telling it is the opposite, to convince James to abandon his search for his wife and instead give in to her. James reacts to the story with sorrow and frustration, lamenting that Mary isn't here, and that it wouldn't make sense for her to be here anyway. He remembers some locations in Silent Hill, but not this one. This tees up an opportunity for Maria to console him, which, I'd wager, is what she wanted all along. But all she gets to do is offer him some comforting words and place a hand on his back, when Laura, screaming at the movie theater, draws their attention. In pursuit of Laura, James and Maria end up in Brookhaven Hospital, where Maria's character takes a dramatic turn. On the top floor, she starts to feel sick. She blames it on a hangover, again highlighting her carefree nature in comparison to Mary. But it's obvious that there's something more going on here. So she downs some pills and decides to rest on a creaky hospital bed. There is more to this scene, but let's stop for a moment and talk about what all this imagery is meant to evoke for James. As the experienced player knows, Mary didn't die 3 years ago. She died 3 days ago, meaning that our protagonist isn't far removed from regular trips to hospitals just like this one. And shortly after entering it, Maria, the over-sexualized fantasy version of Mary, falls ill. She even takes some pills, as Mary certainly did as her illness progressed. And the last time James saw a woman who looked like this asleep in a bed was right before he murdered Mary. It's all meant to give big "it's happening again" energy for James, something that will become a major facet of Maria's character arc going forward, and will later be explored in detail in her ending. Before James leaves, Maria asks him a question that both nods towards the cyclical nature of that ending and alludes to another theme that is about to become central to her character: her versus Mary. As he heads for the door, she asks him what he'd do if he couldn't find Mary. James admits that he hasn't thought about it, and she tells him to get back soon. This comment, much like the story from Moonlight Grove, is meant to get him thinking about the potential hopelessness of his journey, what he'd end up doing next if he was indeed unable to find her, a chord she'll continue to strike from here to the end of the game. Previously, her primary motive was to distract James from finding Mary, to get him to indulge in his selfishness by focusing on her instead. Soon, she'll be trying to get him to accept her as a replacement for Mary, and this comment is the beginning of a further exploration of that goal. While navigating the hospital, you can continue to check in on Maria. Doing so will provide the player with some extra dialogue, and to help trigger the Maria ending. Again, as I discussed earlier, if you want to set up your first run so you can see all 3 of the base endings, it's smart to try and do most of the things you need to do to trigger the Maria ending, because you can manipulate leave or in water later on. In any case, checking in with Maria enough during the stretch will prompt a full cutscene, in which Maria will thank James for continuing to visit her. When you consider the fact that James struggled to visit Mary as her illness progressed, this is darkly ironic, and strengthens why doing this in the first place trends our protagonist towards the Maria ending. Eventually, however, James will discover that Maria has gone missing from her bed. He'll find her again in the hospital's basement, where the replacement conversation becomes stronger than ever. James sees her from down the hall and calls out to her in joy, thinking that she's actually Mary. When he realizes his mistake, he becomes distraught, apologizes, and says that he's glad she's alive. It's worth noting how insensitive James comes off here. We know that Maria is just a manifestation, but he doesn't, at least not at this point in the game. Right now, she's a real person to him, and he treats her like an afterthought. It goes without saying, of course, that he would be happier to see the real Mary, who he thinks is still out there somewhere waiting for him. So between that reality and the metatextual knowledge of who Maria is, it's easy to look past this part of their interaction here. But I do think it's striking how even when she isn't doing it the way she traditionally does, she consistently manages to highlight James's selfishness. Maria calls out James for his lack of sensitivity, draws attention to the danger she's been in, and then says,
"All you care about is that dead wife of yours."
Again, it's Maria, out of all the characters, who consistently brings up that Mary is dead, trying to draw his attention away from her and to the woman in front of him. When James says that this isn't true, she embraces him, says he's supposed to take care of her. Though he seems reluctant to accept her display of affection, it's all red meat for the chauvinistic fantasies we've discussed throughout this video. She's playing into his need to be a white knight, and his desire to be desired by a provocative, sexualized woman. At the end of the scene, they talk about Laura. Maria asks if he found her, and James explains that he did, but that she ended up running away. James questions why Maria cares so much about Laura, and Maria remarks that she feels bad for her, all alone in the town, and feels that she needs to protect her. I think what's happening here with this dialogue is that James is trying to understand the depth of the connection between Maria and Mary. Oblivious as he is to many things, he knows that there's something there, and at this point, he's had a substantial conversation with Laura, so he knows that she knew Mary. And on Maria's end, I think this is evidence that even though she's a manifestation, there are parts of her that have some of Mary's memories, even some of her personality, all of which will make it possible for her to indeed replace Mary if the player chooses to take the story in that direction. Taking this a step further, I think the fact that this comes up now, just as Maria's role is about to change in the narrative, as you'll see in a few minutes, is an indication that the town itself is changing up the way it's utilizing her, seeing if it can't tempt James with how similar she is to Mary rather than the ways she's different from her, all in an attempt to see if he will seek out the Maria ending on his own. One of Maria's most important moments comes up at the end of Otherworld Hospital. Pyramid Head arrives and chases them with a spear. James manages to reach the elevator first, but Maria trips, and though he tries to hold the door open for her, it's no use, as Pyramid Head catches up with them and drives his spear through her chest, killing her instantly. It's here that the concept of Maria as a replacement for Mary takes on a new angle, as Maria becomes a consistent reminder of what James did to Mary. He doesn't know what he did yet, and won't for several in-game hours. But this is all about forcing him to face the truth, forcing him to accept that he murdered Mary, and that she didn't simply die from her disease. In that sense, Maria is more of an accessory to this scene. It's more about Pyramid Head and the grander plot, but she remains at the center of it, allowing James to explore this dark truth from her presence alone. A great deal of time passes before James sees Maria again. When he does find her, it's in the game's notorious Labyrinth level. Trapped behind iron bars, Maria sits in a chair, with a hospital bed and an IV behind her. The imagery here paints a clear picture. The hospital bed and the IV are meant to evoke Mary's bedroom towards the end of her illness, and the cell bars the distance between her and James as her illness progressed. James expresses relief that she's alive, and questions her about how she survived Pyramid Head's attack. But Maria doesn't remember any of this, or at least she pretends not to remember it. There's a sinister edge to this conversation, as she asks James if something happened to him after they got separated in the long hallway. I suppose it's possible that she's being genuine, that in her world, in her Silent Hill, they simply got separated, while in James's Silent Hill she was impaled by Pyramid Head. And I'd be interested in hearing a take that follows this line of thinking. But I don't think that's the case. Between the tone and the long-term understanding of Maria's goals, I think she's essentially gaslighting him here. I am aware that the word gaslighting has been overused in internet discourse as of late, but it's accurate here. She's trying to make him feel crazy, to question the evidence of his eyes and ears. All of this she does in an attempt to blur the lines between her and Mary, which she continues to do with what she says next. She references things that only Mary would remember, saying that James has always been forgetful, and that he left a videotape the two of them made at Lakeview Hotel. This is our first hint at the MacGuffin our protagonist will be seeking out in the game's final act, and it really does blur those lines more than ever before. James presses her about how she knows about that, and who she is, and she responds that she's not his Mary, but that she is Maria, if that's who James wants her to be. In other words, she's suggesting to him that yes, she is Maria, take the right path, and she can become something more, a replacement for Mary. Irritated, James tries to get answers, at which point Maria goes back to flirting, saying that she's here for him, touching his face and encouraging him to touch her back. Even behind bars, with tangible reminders of Mary's illness all around her, she never stops trying to tempt James into selfish self-indulgence. She then sits back down in the chair, telling James that she'll be waiting for him. From there, James leaves, saying he'll be back, and implying that he intends to get her out from behind the bars. As you traverse the labyrinth, you can continue to check in on her, just like back at the hospital. There's not as much extra dialogue here, but you can find her humming to some of the game's music, which is a nice touch. Finally, at the end of the labyrinth, after finding his way behind the cell bars, James comes upon a harrowing sight. Maria, dead in her hospital bed. James cautiously, sorrowfully approaches her body, cradling her arms. There is a look of stunning realization on his face. Again, he's still not all the way there yet, but you can tell that this is a familiar sight for him. He recognizes it from somewhere. It's a mirror image of the condition Mary was likely in after he killed her. In this way, it's both an intriguing and horrifying look at how he likely responded in the aftermath of the murder, aside from what we already know he did: put his wife's body in the backseat of his car and drive to Silent Hill. Following this half-realization, he rises, simply says Mary, and departs. There are two ways you can interpret this. Either it's a demonstration that he knows his focus needs to be elsewhere, away from the distraction that is Maria and towards the mission he came here for in the first place, or a further indication of his selfishness, an illustration that he was beginning to get close to Maria, beginning to accept her presence as a replacement for Mary, but with her gone, moves on, rather quickly and selfishly, to the woman he believes might still be out there for him. These are two very different interpretations, and your own views on James will tell you which one to believe, but I think it's important to provide both, especially in preparation for my August video on James, where I'll need to address the many ways the audience can view his character. But regardless, this marks the second time Maria dies around James, and even more so than her first death at the hands of Pyramid Head, this scene is all about pushing James closer and closer to the truth, to the reality that he murdered Mary. Once more, this makes her role more of an accessory in this particular instance, a supporting character rather than the main focus of analysis, but it nonetheless speaks to the way the game uses Maria as both a reminder of Mary and a means of exploring James's selfishness. Finally, in the game's third act, James finds Maria in the clutches of not one, but two Pyramid Heads. This is the game's last Maria scene that is consistent across a majority of playthroughs. In most of the endings, you will see her again, but the context will differ depending on your decisions. Here, she serves as a stand-in for Mary once again. Hung upside down in a contraption that calls to mind the design of the game's final boss, she begs James to rescue her. But just as before, it's to no avail, as the Pyramid Heads stab her through the chest, thus killing her in front of James for a third time. Now aware of what he did, James at last understands the purpose of Pyramid Head, to force him to accept what he did and deliver the punishment he needed. But that's all over now, and he's ready for the end of his Silent Hill journey. After defeating Pyramid Head, the game's narrative branches. Originally, there were 4 endings to Silent Hill 2, plus 2 joke endings. The remake added 2 original Bloober Team endings to the game, bringing the total to 8. In 4 of them, Maria is heavily featured, either in the concluding segment itself or in the scene before the final boss battle. In the Leave and In Water endings, when James ascends the staircase to the top of Lakeview Hotel, he encounters who he believes to be Mary. But after embracing her, he realizes that this isn't Mary at all. It's Maria, disguised as Mary. He apologizes, so that he knows Maria tried to replace Mary, but that can't change the truth. Mary is gone, and he needs to accept both that reality and the fact that he killed her. He can't just keep pretending that Maria is Mary. She can never be her, no matter how hard she tries, and no matter how much he deludes himself into believing that that's who she is. Undeterred, Maria goes back to her original role in the game. Since she was first killed by Pyramid Head, she'd been more of an accessory to James's journey towards the truth, a manifestation that the town of Silent Hill used to show him, slowly and progressively, that he murdered Mary on her trip back home from the hospital. But now, she's back as a temptress, trying to distract James, to convince him to give in to his selfish desires and go back on all the progress he's made. Taking on the appearance of Mary is just about the final trick she has, her last attempt to convince him to accept her as Mary's replacement. She really lays it on here, saying that she can give him what she never could, that she could be better than her, and that she can be whatever he wants her to be. It's the last gasp of the chauvinistic fantasy. She didn't look like his wife before, but now she does, and she can make his life everything he's always dreamed of, or so she claims. In response, James tells her that this has to stop, that he needs to let it go. It's then that Maria reveals her true nature. She refuses to allow James to reject her, and then transforms into her, the game's final boss, and thus becomes one last reminder of Mary's illness and how he killed her. That Maria appears like this in the preamble to Leave and In Water is a clear indication that in these endings, James rejects everything she represents. The selfish desires that he felt during Mary's illness, and the possibility of her as a replacement for his dead wife. In the lead up to Rebirth, the third ending that includes Maria's involvement, he does something similar, but for very different reasons. In Rebirth, James rejects Maria not because he's accepted what he did, but because he's deluded himself into thinking that with the magic of Silent Hill, he can bring Mary back. Maria calls him out for how crazy he sounds, and James says that in order to complete his plan, he needs to kill the part of him that still clings to her. In this ending, he's essentially gone from replacing Mary with Maria to realizing that he can replace Maria with Mary thanks to the old gods of Silent Hill. Maria refuses to be cast aside and turns into her, as she does in Leave and In Water. Killing her here isn't a reflection of acceptance, but exactly what James just said, the nonsensical idea that by ridding the world of Maria, he can bring back the real Mary. But there is, of course, no ending more affiliated with Maria than the one that bears her name. Unlike Leave, In Water, and Rebirth, in the lead up to this ending, James isn't talking to Maria disguised as Mary. He's straight up talking to Mary. We'll discuss her end of things when we get to Mary's video next month. But focusing on James, she rips into him, reminding him that he killed her, and in this version of events believes that he did so for selfish reasons, because he hated her and wanted to move on with his life. James stunningly admits to this, saying that it was a long 3 years and that he was tired. Mary then turns the conversation to Maria, asking if she can give James the long, happy life he so desires. He tries to explain himself, but he quickly realizes that there's no use, and she's not interested in hearing any more from him anyway. She rises and tells James in an utterly heartbreaking moment that he robbed her of the last precious moment she had on this earth. She then transforms into her, marking the only occasion across the endings where it's Mary, and not Maria, who takes on the role of final boss. Though Maria doesn't appear in this scene, to understand her character, particularly here at the end, it's essential to discuss it. Because even in her absence, everything that happens here revolves around her. For James to be so transparently heartless in his words towards Mary, for him to openly admit that he was tired and that he killed her because she'd become a burden to him, reveals that in this version of events, he has wholly and completely embraced his selfish side, the selfish side represented by Maria. This James didn't love Mary at all. He loved the comfort of a wife, and with Mary gone, he's decided to move on to Maria. Thus, in killing her this time around, James also isn't accepting what he did. He's destroying the side of him that came to this town in search of his long-lost love, and embracing the selfishness that led him to his new love. And in the ending that follows, that's exactly what happens. James returns to Heaven's Night and wakes up Maria. She hands him the letter from Mary, the one he's been looking for all along. In yet another act of repulsive selfishness, he pockets it, thereby rejecting Mary one more time, and leaves with Maria. Back at the lake overlook, on the way to his car, where he's been keeping Mary's body, mind you, Maria lets out a cough. He coldly tells her that she better do something about it. And on that note, the game ends. The implication here is that James has learned nothing, and as a punishment for his sins, he's about to start the whole process anew. He might leave Silent Hill with Maria, but soon enough, she'll get sick, just like Mary, and years from now, he'll return to the resort town to once again be tormented by the likes of Pyramid Head, the manifestation of the wife he killed. It's this ending, more than all the others, that alludes to the loop theory, the long-held fan theory that James is in a recurring cycle, repeating the same sequence of events until he reaches a point of acceptance in either leave or in water. But critically, it's this ending that drives home the purpose of Maria, to distract James from his true goal, to tempt him towards selfishness and chauvinism. And in this ending, she succeeds. And that's what makes Maria so important to Silent Hill 2. Thanks for watching. This video took a while to put together, and even though it's nearly 45 minutes in length, there's still more I'd love to explore about some of the topics I mentioned earlier, specifically Silent Hill 2's take on masculinity. That's a major theme I cover in my own creative writing, so I suppose I'll have to take a deep dive into that topic at some point down the line here. Huge thanks to my Silent Hill collaborators Mathias T, Solice, and David Peppiatt, who allowed me to use their covers from various Silent Hill games for this video. To check out all three of these amazing artists, just follow the links down in the description box. Big shout out to all my silver and gold tier YouTube channel members and Patreon subscribers, including James Pruitt, Little Caesar, Reed, Bethonian, Anna Novikova, and Sean Bobby, who get early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time, and go birds!